today's text, Galatians chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we have hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. You were running a good race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I am confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion, whoever they may be, will have to pay the penalty. Brothers and sisters, if I am still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. As for those agitators, I wish they would go all the way and emasculate themselves. The word of the Lord. Yeah, kind of a hard turn there at the end. As I mentioned earlier, Rachel, I know, is going to highlight a lot more in her sermon on the circumcision aspect and some of the, or I'd imagine she's going to. In fact, why am I imagining anything? Let's find out together. So you can hear her on this, if you're listening to this online, the same feed. But all of Galatians up to this point has been building to this line. It is for freedom that you have been set free. Don't let yourself go back into bondage. You are called to be free. So before we go too far, I want you to think for a second. When did you experience in your life the greatest freedom? What point of your life, when was it that you experienced the most freedom? Or maybe another way to put it, where do you currently experience the greatest amount of freedom? When you think, where are you most free? How would you answer that question? You know what? I think we're just small enough for this to not be a rhetorical question. So let's hear from some of you. When, either in the past or in your current situation, where do you or where have you experienced the greatest amount of freedom? Hiking, out in the open. Oh, yeah. Beautiful. So one is a context of relationship, one is the context of outdoors. Just out of curiosity, how many of you, when you were thinking, had something more like Jeff's experience of being outdoors or exploring or out in nature, how many of you had something that was in line more in the context of a relationship? Ooh, look at that, split right down the middle, and it's okay if you had both. And as we read scripture, as we read any text, we have to remember that our culture and our experiences shape the way we read it, especially the word freedom. As you thought about freedom, for me, I'll confess, mine was more in alignment with what Jeff was saying, and even more so, just to double down on it, my experience is being alone. I was in New York this week, and we're at this conference, a bunch of about 100 pastors and leaders, and there's an author named Shauna Niequist, and she was kind of one of the architects of the conference, and she was asking us, Tuesday night's free and open, it's an open night in New York. Is anybody doing something that you think others might be interested in joining you in? And I had bought a Yankees ticket for $6, and I wanted to experience the stadium. Like as a baseball fan, I wanted to be at a Yankees game. As a human being, I knew it was going to be a challenge to be surrounded by Yankees fans, which proved to be the case. But when she asked that question, anybody doing something that you might want some company, and me saying I had a $5 Yankees ticket, but I don't want to raise my hand because I don't want to have to manage where we're going to meet. How are we're going to get in the subway together? When do we get off the subway? Which gate do we go in? How long do we stay at the game? Because I'll tell you, it was a game that went into extra innings as the Baltimore Orioles rallied and ended in the 11th inning with a walk-off. That happened when I was already in bed asleep because I left at what proved to be about the midpoint of the game. Because to me, freedom is being out from under any obligations, even the obligations of riding in the subway together. That's freedom for me. And when Paul wrote these words, I can tell you with absolute certainty, he was not thinking of the freedom that comes from getting and escaping any and all obligations towards one another. And I know that because when he talks about what the freedom should look like, he talks about faithfulness to God, which is a limitation of our freedom, and expressing that in love to others, which is definitely a limitation of our freedom, because you cannot love someone without also accepting limitations to your freedom. As we continue, I want you to hold this image in your head. Paul talks about freedom as a particular kind of bondage, a bondage to faithfulness to Jesus expressed in love of neighbor. That is not, those obligations are not how we as 21st century, 2022 Californians think about freedom, as accepting from the responsibility to be faithful to Christ and accepting the expression of that faithfulness primarily taking place in the context of community expressed in love. My view of freedom is about freedom from obligations and responsibilities. When you talk to 20-somethings and you say, hey, you know, married, kid, like, what do you see in the future? What you'll hear a lot is, maybe in my 30s, but for now I want to pursue a career, I want to travel, and you'll hear, you know, the marriaging age. Is marriage a verb? Marriaging? I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but the age in which people get married is rising. When I got married, I was 28. I was right in the middle of the average age of getting married. That age, I bet for men, is now closer to 30. Because marriage and the covenantal relationship formed is a bondage. It's limiting. You can't, I remember talking to Ian and Jessica when they were pregnant for the very first time. And I said, travel. Go somewhere, because when you have kids, travel is a lot more complicated. So let me talk about Robert Bella, who he's a sociologist. He wrote a landmark book in 1985 called Habits of the Heart. Anybody by chance read that book? I had to read it in seminary. Robert Bella, Bellah. Habits of the Heart. The subtitle is Individualism and Commitment in the American Life. Think about those two words, individualism, commitment. Can you feel a tension there between individualism and contentment? My imagination of Scripture, the word freedom, is shaped by my radical commitment to individualism, as evidenced by my journey to a Yankees game last week. I don't think of myself naturally as a member of community, as part of a network of social connections that provide a fabric for a city to thrive. Those connections are necessary for any healthy country, any healthy city, is to acknowledge the interdependence. Independence is in conflict with interdependence. Think about the movies we love, like Top Gun. It's on everybody's mind right now. I haven't seen the new one yet, so don't worry, I'm not going to spoil the new one. But in the original one, Goose died. So I hope you all saw that one. Otherwise, that was really... So you have Maverick, embodied by Tom Cruise, who probably wasn't acting. He was just being Tom Cruise in these situations, because if anybody embodies the cocky, ugly American better than Tom Cruise, I would love to know who that is. Because I say ugly American because he doesn't think the rules apply to him, just does what he wants. The rules, those are for those other guys, they're not for me. He wants to be the best. He is reckless. His recklessness gets his best friend killed and makes him a liability, because you are a liability in combat, because when your life is on the line, the last thing you want is a wingman who is primarily looking out for themselves. So it's a journey there for our friend Maverick. And what Robert Bell observed almost 30 years ago is only more true today. I'm going to read you a quote right now, okay? And you tell me, is this more true than it was in 1985? Equally true as it was, or less true now? Freedom is perhaps the most resonant, deeply held American value. In some ways, it defines the good in both personal and political life. Yet, freedom turns out to mean being left alone by others, not having other people's values, ideas, or styles of life forced upon you, being free of arbitrary authority in work, family, and political life. What it is that one might do with that freedom is much more difficult for Americans to define. So what he's saying is freedom, and by freedom, specifically I mean a release of any obligations from the outside of me, is the defining American characteristic. But what that freedom is for is unclear. What do we do with our freedom? What are we supposed to do with this freedom? This lack of restraints, and what is the end goal of that? What does that freedom lead us to? What kind of people does it lead us to? Because freedom is a great means, but it's a terrible goal. Wanting freedom is a terrible thing, if that's your goal. If you want freedom in order to do something great in the world, then freedom's a great tool. You want that freedom to worship, freedom to protest and march, freedom of speech. These are all great freedoms if there's some end in mind that is beyond freedom. It's a great means, but its end is confusing to us. And when freedom becomes an end unto itself, a society can't hold itself together. There's no center to hold it together. If all we want to do is be left alone, if all we want to do is get out from under any obligation, well, if you've ever been a boss, but what's somebody who's like a manager? If you've ever managed people, thank you. John briefly forgot the word manager, which is why he writes such copious notes. If you have ever managed somebody and said to them, hey, did you finish those TPS reports? And they're like, why are you burdening me with that? I'm in the middle of scrolling through social media right now. How dare you encroach on my personal freedoms right now? It doesn't work at any level. I was a teacher. I remember sitting on a conference with another teacher where he was telling the parent, your son does not respect me. And the dad looked at the teacher, referring to his 12-year-old son, and said, you have to earn my son's respect. Yeah, my friend lost his mind. He could not believe that a parent would say something like that. But individuals pursuing their own self-interest will fall apart when we face, a global pandemic. And wearing a mask indoors limits my personal freedom, but creates the freedom in a society to safely gather and to safely shop and to do things safely. So the question is, whose freedom? My freedom to be away from the tyranny of wearing a mask, or freedom from COVID? Freedom from 1 million people dying. Those are two different freedoms. One rejects any external authority. One accepts personal responsibility and joins a global, worldwide movement to protect one another, especially those who are the most medically fragile and vulnerable. If American freedom is freedom from constraint, then that also is freedom from responsibility, and that's also freedom from things like safety, or a national tragedy like a mass shooting. You can see I'm too angry to care right now how some of these words may be misinterpreted. The mass shooting of children should be something that brings a country together. If there's one thing that we can all agree on, is that that is evil and one of the most unimaginable atrocities that can be committed in a nation. But instead, the conversation goes to what? Private, personal freedoms. The right of an individual to, on his 18th birthday, the first day he could legally do it, to buy an assault rifle. That freedom, even though that leads to the loss of freedom that we all share to go places and feel safe, we're willing to sacrifice that freedom so that we can hold to the idea, to this idea of the right to bear arms. And I know that, I don't think this is a space to really nuance that statement. That we are reaping what we're sowing. Freedom, for one, is always oppression to another. Me insisting my freedom over and against any obligation to anyone else is a cancer that will destroy a nation from the inside out. Bella later observes that the freedom to be left alone becomes the freedom to be alone. That, of course, loneliness is the great epidemic of our age because we understand freedom as freedom from each other. That is literally how C.S. Lewis describes hell in The Great Divorce. The freedom to be away from any obligation, and people move further and further apart and become less and less real in the process. Our understanding of freedom is actually a curse that isolates us. It moves us away from love because there is no self-interest in love. Self-interest is opposed to love. Me seeking my needs from you moves me away from love. Paul writes that freedom is faith made real in love. Freedom is Paul's alternative to legalism. I've talked about freedom from the law. I've talked about how Paul has argued very carefully that we are no longer bound by the law of Moses. So the question that lurks behind this freedom is Paul saying everyone for himself? Everyone for herself? We can just do whatever we want now? There's no more rules? Anytime you're like, hey man, you lied to me. You're like, hey, I'm not under the law anymore. I can do whatever I want. That's what Paul is saying in the book of Galatians. And you would say, I'm pretty sure that's what he's not saying. Or he's not saying that. So what is he saying? Since Paul is arguing that we are no longer bound by the law of Moses, does this give us the freedom to do whatever we want and to make up our own rules as we go? It is easy, again, to put Paul's words into our existing framework. We, or at least I, tend to put this in the classic debates of our age between liberalism and conservatism. Is Paul weighing in on, is essentially saying, hey guys, I'm liberal here. Just do what you want. The law doesn't matter. You make your own law. It's private individuals doing what's best for them, pursuing their own definition of the good life. I've seen this over and over again. A fundamentalist, a person who grew up in kind of a conservative fundamentalist church, grows up, says, I don't want to be part of that anymore. That is an abusive system. I need to get out from under it. And then they go and they become a fundamentalist liberal. Just as, if not more obnoxious than they were when they were a fundamentalist conservative, that they become a fundamentalist just as obnoxious, just as legalistic, following the same script. These are the bad ones, we are the good ones. These are the rules, this is the language one must use, this is how we are to talk about people and one another. This is who we need to create space for. These are the people that we need to isolate and demonize. And it's the same script of fundamentalism. It's like a Mad Libs, where they now fill in the people that are destroying this country are this group. The people that God really despises and who aren't authentic and following Jesus are this other group. Therefore, we are justified in demonizing them, outcasting them, canceling them, whatever language you want to use to it. It's the same play group. It is so easy to think you're leaving fundamentalism and essentially just become a different kind of fundamentalist. There has to be a new script, a new way of going through this. which is what Paul is giving us here. Paul is not talking about liberalism versus conservatism, because they're both founded on legalism. They're both a different kind of legalism. Legalism always divides. Legalism always splits. Paul will not abide by division. If he sees division, he says, I know something's wrong. It's like a doctor finding some symptom, saying, I don't know what's the cause of this symptom, but if you're manifesting this symptom, something's very wrong and we need to figure out what that is. That's what Paul is with division. If you abide by the law, then Paul says you have to follow all of it. And if you follow this rule and say, this is what it means to follow Jesus, you have to be circumcised. He's kind of using circumcision for shorthand, which the old youth pastor, teenage boy in me kind of likes because of how awkward and uncomfortable it is. But he says, if you look to your righteousness to save you, it will crush you. So let me give you 3 examples of freedom to help us reform and reshape our imagination of what Paul is talking about. So I'm going to give you an example of a musician, an athlete, and a linguist. And they're all there, there's the exact same example. And it's going to feel pedantic at the end, but that's okay. Repetition is how you learn, because you learn by repeating things. So a musician. In what sense am I free to play this piano? I can sit down at it. I've got a bunch of keys. I want to say 88, but I have no idea how many keys there actually are in there. How many? I was right. Thank you. I don't think that was a guess. I'm sure that number is somewhere in my head. I am free to make noise with that piano. I'm not free to make music with that piano. Julie is free to make music with that piano. I will only be, as Paul will later say, a resounding gong and a clanging cymbal when I sit down and try to play that, because I'm not free to play music because I've not practiced the scale. I've not submitted to the yoke of music theory and to the yoke of physically training my mind and fingers and body to play music. I'm not free, whereas others are free to play the great works of music because of their practice. Or athletes, there's a game 7 tonight in basketball, which one of the distinctives of Restoration is that only Ben and I know that there's a game 7 tonight between the Celtics and the Miami Heat. And Tom, I apologize, Tom. Tom, Ben, and I have the one connection of sports, professional sports athletics. Apologize if there are others. Tom just had this look of utter defeat of like, have you not known me for a decade of life? And the fact that he's not wearing Rams gear right now is just means that the season's just still a couple months off. Anyway, the great athletes are free to compete because they've taken on the yoke of practice and exercise. I did some bouldering with Bree, Maddie, Ben. You were there, Ben, I remember. Yeah, you were there. Yeah, this was and going up and down the hill. And I would watch these 3 climb a rock and say, these 3 are free to get from the top to the bottom of that rock. No, that's the other way, isn't it? Where you climb up, don't we? Start at the bottom and get up to the top, as the great poet Drake said. So, you're free to scale that rock because of your practice and understanding technique, strengthening your body. The fact that you don't have this giant refrigerator of a body helps you. But still, not to overwhelm that when you are free through submitting to the law of physics, which is a stubborn law, and to technique, to be able to do things that you cannot do independent of practice and submission. Same with language. You are free to speak another language when you put in the time to learn it. You can't just randomly say foreign words and be understood. There has to be a syncopation with the laws of language. That was a really awkward way to say it. So here it is. The greatest freedom is found when we learn and practice love. That ought not be something you think comes naturally to you. that ought to be something that, like music, like athletics, or like learning another language, requires submission as a way of achieving and finding that freedom. We are not born with the ability to play the piano, climb rocks, or speak a second language. But through submission, through learning, and that's what Paul is saying here. Submit to Jesus. He is the one who is the author of music theory. He's the one who thought of music. He's the one who created our bodies. Like, he's the one that is what, to quote C.S. Lewis one more time, he's the author of the deep magic that we can learn from. Go back and think about the way you thought of freedom at the beginning, where it is that you are most free. And allow me to help shape our imagination for what freedom looks like. Imagine freedom from greed and towards generosity. Imagine freedom from addiction into health and life. Freedom from isolation into community. Free from being independent and free of all of you to recognizing our independence and our need for one another. Free from a life of privilege and prosperity into a life of diversity and to making space for others. This is the freedom offered us, and it runs contrast to the way our imagination has been shaped in this country, to imagine it as freedom from rather than freedom to love. This is the freedom offered to us. And Paul says, you must stand firm in our freedom and not backslide back into legalism, into hatred and division. May God give us the strength to stand in that freedom, free to live out our faith in love and come to the table, the feast of love given to us. This is the foundation of our faith, us coming to the table together. And as you return to your seat, begin to allow your imagination to be shaped and marked by the freedom to love God and to love your neighbor. For the world right now needs people whose thoughts and prayers are made real in faith expressing itself in love.